Los Angeles, 1972. In a middle-class home in the San Fernando Valley, a kid was being raised by parents who'd soon realize their son would rather tinker with circuit boards than finish his algebra homework. His name was Steve Jobs, and he was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can give a restless teenager isn't freedom, it's access to a garage and a friend who knows how to code. Steve wasn't born into poverty, but he wasn't exactly silver spoon material either. His biological parents, a Syrian graduate student and an American speech therapist, gave him up for adoption before he could even open his eyes. Paul and Clara Jobs, a machinist and an accountant, took him in. They weren't wealthy, but they made a promise to Steve's birth mother that they'd send him to college. Spoiler alert, that didn't exactly go according to plan. Even as a kid, Steve was intense. Not in the sports team captain kind of way, more in the I'm going to stare at this transistor radio until I understand how reality works kind of way. He'd take apart electronics, rebuild them, then take them apart again just to see if he could do it faster. His parents didn't quite know what to do with him. Most kids collected baseball cards. Steve collected questions that made adults uncomfortable. In high school, he met Steve Wozniak through a mutual friend. Was older, brilliant, and obsessed with building computers for fun. Not for money, not for fame, just because making machines think was the coolest thing he could imagine. The two Steves bonded immediately. One had the technical genius. The other had the vision and the audacity to believe they could actually change the world. Their first collaboration wasn't exactly legal. They built blue boxes, devices that hacked phone systems to make free long-distance calls. They sold them to Berkeley students for $150 a pop. It was technically wire fraud, but to Steve, it was proof of concept. If people would pay for this, they'd pay for anything that gave them power they weren't supposed to have. After high school, Jobs enrolled at Reed College in Portland, one of the most expensive schools in America. His adoptive parents had promised, and they kept their word, even though it drained their savings. But Steve lasted exactly one semester before dropping out. He found the required classes boring and couldn't justify spending his parents' money on courses about subjects he didn't care about. So he quit. But here's the thing, he didn't leave. He stuck around campus for another 18 months, sleeping on floors, returning Coke bottles for food money, and sneaking into classes that actually interested him. One of those classes was calligraphy. He learned about serif fonts, typography, and beautiful design. At the time, it seemed completely useless. Years later, it would become the aesthetic foundation of every Apple product ever made. Eventually, Steve drifted back to California. He got a job at Atari, the video game company, as a technician. He wasn't exactly employee of the month material. Coworkers complained he didn't shower enough, and had a habit of telling people their ideas were garbage directly to their faces. Management's solution was to put him on the night shift so he wouldn't have to interact with humans as much. Classic Steve. But while he was difficult, he was also undeniably brilliant. He convinced Atari to send him to India on a spiritual journey, claiming it would make him a better employee. They actually said yes. He spent months wandering through temples, experimenting with meditation, and occasionally experimenting with LSD because it was the 70s, and that's just what people did. He came back thinner, weirder, and more convinced than ever that technology and spirituality weren't opposites. They were two sides of the same quest for transcendence. Meanwhile, was still tinkering. By 1975, he'd built something remarkable in his spare time, a fully functional personal computer. Not a kit, not a calculator with delusions of grandeur, an actual computer that normal people could theoretically use. He showed it to Steve, expecting maybe some light encouragement. Instead, Steve looked at it and said, "We're starting a company." Was hesitant. He had a stable job at HP. He wasn't interested in business. He just wanted to build cool stuff and share designs with his hobbyist friends for free. But Steve had a gift for persuasion that bordered on psychological warfare. He convinced Woz that they weren't just building computers. They were giving individuals power that had previously only belonged to corporations and governments. This wasn't about money. This was about revolution. Was caved. They needed capital. Steve sold his Volkswagen van. Was sold his HP calculator. Together, they scraped together $1,300. On April 1, 1976, April Fool's Day, because of course it was, they officially founded Apple Computer Company. The name came from Steve's time working on an Oregon commune's orchard. It sounded friendly, non-threatening, and it would appear before Atari in the phone book. Strategic and weird, just like Steve. Their headquarters was Paul Jobs' garage. Their first product was the Apple I, a bare circuit board that required users to add their own keyboard, monitor, and case. It was designed for hobbyists, the kind of people who thought soldering on a Saturday night was a good time. Steve convinced a local computer store owner to buy 50 units for $500 each. There was one problem: the store wanted fully assembled computers, not DIY kits. So Steve scrambled, begging parts suppliers for credit, assembling boards with Woz and a small crew of friends working around the clock. They delivered on time. Barely. The Apple I was a modest success, but Steve knew it wasn't enough. It was too niche, too complicated. If they wanted to change the world, they needed a product that anyone could use, even people who didn't know a motherboard from a cutting board. So they got to work on the Apple II. Woz handled the engineering. Steve obsessed over everything else: the design, the packaging, the marketing. He insisted the case be sleek and colorful, not the beige industrial box every other computer came in. He wanted it to look like something you'd be proud to have in your living room, not something you'd hide in a basement. The Apple II launched in 1977, and it was a phenomenon. It had color graphics, which was unheard of. It could run spreadsheet software, which made it useful for businesses. And it looked beautiful, which made it desirable. Within 3 years, Apple went from a garage operation to a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Steve Jobs, the college dropout who once survived on free meals from a Hare Krishna temple, was suddenly very, very rich. But success didn't mellow him. If anything, it made him more intense. Inside Apple, he became notorious for his brutal honesty and sky-high standards. He'd look at prototypes engineers had spent months perfecting and say, "This is garbage, start over." He didn't do it to be cruel. He genuinely believed that anything less than perfect was a waste of everyone's time. His employees either loved him or hated him. Sometimes both in the same day. In 1980, Apple went public. The IPO made Steve worth $200 million overnight. He was 25 years old. The boy who dropped out of college because he didn't want to waste his parents' money was now richer than most of his former classmates would ever be. But he wasn't satisfied. Money was just a side effect. What he really wanted was to build something that would outlive him. That obsession led to the Macintosh. Steve envisioned a computer so intuitive, so elegant, that using it would feel like magic. He assembled a team of the best engineers and designers he could find, then pushed them mercilessly. He wanted perfection, and he didn't care how many all-nighters it took. The Mac team started wearing t-shirts that said 90 hours a week and loving it, though the loving it part was debatable. The Macintosh launched in 1984 with one of the most famous commercials in history. Directed by Ridley Scott, it aired during the Super Bowl and depicted a dystopian future where a lone rebel destroys a totalitarian regime. The subtext was clear: IBM was Big Brother and Apple was the revolution. It was bold, dramatic, and quintessentially Steve Jobs. The Mac itself was groundbreaking. It had a graphical user interface, a mouse, and fonts that didn't look like they'd been typed on a typewriter from 1952. For the first time, computers felt human. But there was a problem: it was underpowered, overpriced, and incompatible with most business software. Sales were disappointing. The revolution would have to wait. Internally, Apple was fracturing. Steve's relentless intensity had created a toxic environment. Board members grew tired of his outbursts and his refusal to compromise. In 1985, after a power struggle with CEO John Sculley, a man Steve himself had recruited, the board sided against him. Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple, was forced out of his own company. He was 30 years old, and he'd just lost everything he'd spent the last decade building. For most people, that would have been the end. But Steve wasn't most people. He was angry, humiliated, and more determined than ever. If Apple didn't want him, fine. He'd build something better. He founded Next, a new computer company aimed at the education market. The Next computer was beautiful, powerful, and absurdly expensive. It flopped commercially, but the software that was special. Next developed an operating system so advanced it would eventually become the foundation for every Apple product you've ever used. At the same time, Steve made another move that seemed random but would change everything. He bought a struggling animation studio from George Lucas for $5 million. It was called Pixar. At first, it was just a side project, a money pit that made expensive short films nobody watched. But Steve saw potential. He kept funding it, kept believing in it, even when everyone told him to cut his losses. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a massive hit. Suddenly, Steve's side project was worth billions. When Pixar went public, Steve's shares were worth more than his entire stake in Apple had ever been. The dropout who got fired from his own company had just become a billionaire all over again. Meanwhile, Apple was dying. Without Steve's vision, the company had lost its way. It released a dozen forgettable products, lost billions of dollars, and was months away from bankruptcy. In 1997, in a move that felt like poetic justice, Apple bought Next for $400 million. And just like that, Steve Jobs was back. Not as a founder, not as an employee, but as the guy brought in to save the company he'd started in a garage 21 years earlier. Steve didn't waste time. He killed over 70% of Apple's product line, focusing only on what mattered. He struck a deal with Microsoft, Apple's longtime rival, to invest $150 million and ensure Office software would keep running on Macs. People thought he'd lost his mind. But Steve understood something they didn't: survival first, revenge later. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac. It was colorful, translucent, and looked like nothing else on the market. Critics called it a toy. Consumers called it irresistible. It sold millions. Apple was back from the dead. But Steve wasn't done. Not even close. He'd spent years in exile thinking about what came next. And what came next would make the Mac look like a warm-up. 2001, the iPod. Apple wasn't the first company to make an MP3 player, but it made the first one people actually wanted. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Simple, elegant, revolutionary. The music industry tried to fight it. Steve didn't care. He built iTunes, convinced record labels to sell songs for 99 cents, and within a few years, Apple controlled the entire digital music market. Then came the real kill shot. January 2007, Steve walked on stage holding a device that looked like a piece of glass. He called it the iPhone. It was a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator all in one. No keyboard, no stylus, just a touch screen and software so intuitive a toddler could use it. Industry experts said it would fail. Microsoft's CEO literally laughed at it. Within a year, the iPhone had reshaped the entire tech industry. Companies that didn't adapt went extinct. Apple followed up with the iPad, the App Store, the MacBook Air. Every product refined, simplified, made beautiful. Steve's calligraphy class, the one he'd crashed as a broke dropout, had become the design language of the most valuable company on earth. His insistence on perfection, the thing that got him fired, was now the reason Apple was untouchable. But by 2011, Steve was sick. He'd been battling pancreatic cancer for years, hiding it from the public as long as he could. In August, he stepped down as CEO. 2 months later, he was gone. He was 56 years old. The dropout who'd been fired, humiliated, and written off had built the most valuable company in history, revolutionized 6 industries, and proved that vision, obsession, and a willingness to burn every bridge if necessary could change the world. Today, Apple is worth over $3 trillion. Every iPhone, every MacBook, every sleek product shot carries Steve's fingerprints. Not because he wrote the code or soldered the chips, but because he understood something most people don't. Technology isn't about specs or features. It's about how it makes you feel. And if you can make people feel something, you don't just build a company. You build a religion. The high school dropout who slept on floors and returned Coke bottles for food money didn't just create a tech empire. He created a mirror, and when the world looked into it, they saw the future.